Hello again, and welcome to the Hawk Moor Castle Old Skull project, where we explore the deepest roots of Dungeons & Dragons in search of greater understanding and forgotten details that we can use to move forward into the future of old school inspired game design. Today, we are looking at Gary's very first dungeon module and how it set the scene for the giants of the world of Greyhawk as risen from the elder pages of Norse mythology. Gygax, Greyhawk, and Giants. A grim saga of giant foemen. The Steading of the Hill Giant Chief. In the year of 1978, TSR Games released a most remarkable product for its advanced Dungeons & Dragons role-playing game. The very first dungeon module, coded G1, an offering entitled Steading of the Hill Giant Chief. Earlier, TSR had published the Arnisonian Dungeon Fortress scenario, Temple of the Frog, as edited and presented by Tim Kask and featured in Dungeons & Dragons Supplement 2, Blackmoor, in 1975. And TSR had also offered We Warriors Dungeon Masters Kit No. 1, Palace of the Vampire Queen, in 1976 through mail order. The company had further authorized a line of licensed Dungeons & Dragons source packs and dungeon settings, which were being faithfully published month by month via the Judges Guild, beginning with the unforgettable maps for the city-state of the Invincible Overlord from 1976 and thereafter. These milestone pre-advanced Dungeons & Dragons offerings, crude and glorious as they were deemed in many ways rather ambitious, groundbreaking, and difficult to improve upon, but G1 was something special, destined to surmount them. It was indeed superior, a high-quality, fully illustrated product officially produced by TSR and designed by the co-author of the original Dungeons & Dragons game, Gary Gygax himself. Steading of the Hill Giant Chief was fated to become the blueprint and inspirational template for the many hundreds of adventure modules, which would continue to be published by various entities over the next 37 years, and counting. By many measures, G1 and its related adventures are regarded as being among the very best Dungeons & Dragons scenarios of all time. As we shall see, and as many a veteran dungeon master would ascertain, the true legacy of G1 is inherent in its presentation of its ideas. Arguably, no other adventure supplement, with the exception of Dungeon Module B2, Keep on the Borderlands, taught so many people how to design a quality setting for Dungeons & Dragons play. Modules come and go, and many of them are forgotten, but despite its being bare-boned, the basic format of Steading is largely still regarded as the industry standard today. For such a gigantic historical landmark, Steading had modest beginnings, which are still somewhat shrouded in mystery. Gary worked on the module's manuscript during a relative hiatus, while the advanced Dungeons & Dragons system was still being refined from its conceptual stages, dividing itself from basic D&D and original D&D. This mulling over of ideas may have begun in late 1977, and was then fully written out in early 1978. These were intense times, when Gary was working 60 to 70 hours a week on game design while running TSR. He could take only a week or two to write Module G1 and to prepare it for playtesting. In observing industry sales trends throughout 1977, Gary and his co-workers had become certain that TSR needed to move into the lucrative adventure scenario submarket with some high-quality offerings of its own. He also knew that as the co-creator of Dungeons & Dragons, he would need to author these new scenarios himself. Despite a clear market hunger for pre-scripted adventures of any kind, Gary was nevertheless reluctant to abandon the do-it-yourself kit approach, which was exemplified by his earlier Dungeon Geomorphs and the Monster and Treasure Assortment accessory lines. Sadly, the sales of those earlier toolkit products had been disappointing. The Dungeons & Dragons accessory market was moving away from Gary's ideal of toolkit-assisted personal craftsmanship and ever closer to mass-market convenience. Most dungeon masters then, as now, desired unique, fully scripted episodes for play instead of mentoring design guides, and they would pay handsomely for the privilege. If TSR would not produce such material, then customers seeking time savers would simply look elsewhere. And other companies would be only too happy to provide complete scenarios to neophyte dungeon masters for cash. For Gary, the clock was ticking. The product hunger, fan requests, and onrushing competition collectively forced his hand. As he once recalled, quote, TSR was getting a lot of requests for adventure modules, so I did all of the initial modules, the G&D trilogies, the Giant and Drow stories, strictly to fill the void in the company's product line. It is no coincidence that in later years, Gary would offer this sage advice to would-be game designers everywhere. Save your masterworks, he urged. Instead, do the designing or writing that the audience wants. As Gary and crew prepared to publish G1, the marketing aspect of this emerging product line was carefully considered within TSR. The company needed to provide its own unique elaboration upon the already existing trend toward pre-scripted adventure packs so that TSR could establish a true flagship brand for the industry to follow. TSR was well accustomed to leading, but in this case they were already more than a year behind the times, and still more competitors were circling and moving in. How could TSR use efficacious branding to differentiate their own adventures from others' more amateur offerings? This need for a marketing catchword presented a bit of a problem, as editor Tim Kask would recall, because gamers already strongly associated the obvious term scenario with wargames and miniatures. But the relatively unused technical terms module and modular were in subcultural fashion at the time, particularly in regard to NASA space missions, textbooks, architecture, and cognitive studies. These could be effective buzzwords. No one can quite remember whether Gary devised the term dungeon module, or Tim, or Brian Bloom, but the name felt right for the product at the time. The decided upon terminology for TSR Dungeons & Dragons adventure booklets then became dungeon module. This term implied not only technical specificity, but also a series of interrelated offerings. By definition, a module is a standalone, pre-configured component which can be used interchangeably within a larger design. TSR was therefore underlining the fact that the dungeon modules were optional building and expansion tools, and each dungeon master could thus collect them all or pick and choose according to his or her need. Gary and crew planned to design the modules so that they could be used either as sequels to one another, module G1, then G2, then G3, etc., or as standalone adventures. The earliest advertisement for G1 gives us further insight into the thinking behind TSR's marketing at the time. By using the dungeon modules, we read, a dungeon master can moderate a pre-developed game situation with a minimum of preparation, and players can use new or existing characters for adventuring. The applications and possibilities are many. Incorporation of the modules and their locales into existing Dungeons & Dragons campaigns or as one-time adventures simply for a change of pace." Unquote. The idea was solid, and TSR's testers, artists, and editor were ready to meet the project's demands. All that Gary needed to do was to write an unforgettable adventure, which everyone would want to play, setting the market path for pre-scripted modules for decades to come. Simple. Actually, it was not simple at all. Facing this conundrum, Gary decided to follow his instincts. He loved the pulp swords and sorcery story genre, and some of his favorite tales involved the mytho-comedic misadventures of character Harold Shea. Why not draw inspiration from the very first tale of Shea, which had playfully tweaked the poem Thrimskiptha, the Lay of Thrym, and the various sagas of Norse mythology? Knowing he had the workings of a good idea there, that might be difficult to work, but still good, Gary drew his primary inspiration from The Roaring Trumpet, a story from 1940. This is the first incomplete Enchanter novella written by Lyon Sprague de Camp and Fletcher Pratt. The tale of the Roaring Trumpet is a deceptively simple one. In this story, a 20th century intellectual bumbler becomes an accidental explorer of alternate dimensions and, to his dismay, is promptly plopped down into a pre-Ragnarok clash between the giants and the gods. Amusingly, he is then forced to survive between these two factions by wit alone, but he learns from his endless cultural blunders with speed and life-saving grace. In following the example of de Camp and Pratt, Gary intended only to outline a hill giant's fortress and to leave it at that. Steading, the module, in its earliest conception, was going to be a standalone scenario, but once Gary started writing and the adventure's Greyhawk surroundings began to unfold, he found it hard to stop. There was significant potential in this modular format for a complete series of interrelated adventures, not only in marketing, but in Gary's own campaign development as well. As he once explained, quote, "I began with only the Hill Giants fort, but as that developed, the concept of a larger adventure came, so that by the time I had finished G1, the springboards for G2 and G3 were well in mind, and the whole of the underworld to follow as well. Each adventure in the G-Giant trilogy would thus feature a stronger set of giant foemen, so that the difficulty of the sequential adventures could increase over time. As we know, Gary had already conceived the giants of Dungeons & Dragons in 1972 to 1974 as being represented by 5 subspecies, from weakest to strongest, the Hill Giants, Stone, Frost, Fire, and Cloud. Storm Giants were added a bit later in the Greyhawk supplement. Of those sub-races, Stone Giants are neutral, Storm Giants are good, and Cloud Giants can be either good or evil, so the 3 ascending tiers of purely evil giant foemen are therefore Hill, Frost, and Fire. These were, not coincidentally, the very same races of the antagonists, which had been featured alongside trolls in the tale The Roaring Trumpet too. Considering this and the precepts of the already published Monster Manual, just released over Christmas 1977, it seemed to Gary that hints in the Hill Giant stronghold should lead to the lair of the Frost Giants, and the Frost Giant domain's revelations should in turn lead into the fortress of the Fire Giants and their loathsome troll servants. In this way, the 3 G modules would progress in level of challenge from fairly hard to insanely difficult. This, by the way, would make the G scenarios perfectly suited to frame tournament rounds in competitive advanced D&D, and that is exactly how they were first put to use. These were not introductory scenarios. This shrewd design choice, however, presented another quandary. The brutish hill giants of the Roaring Trumpet are colorfully represented, but the details are sparse, and Norse mythology is not much help either. They are, for example, fleetingly mentioned 8 times, the Hill Giants, in the 1916 English translation of Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, but compared to the much better represented Frost Giants and Fire Giants, the lore for Hill Giants is lacking at best. We learn very little from such sources of the Hill Giants' unique characteristics, their beliefs, their origins, their destiny, or their leadership. Gary would therefore need to find other resonant sources and legendary to assist him in fleshing out the Steading's Hill Giants as evocative and fearsome foes with a culture all their own. One of Gary's inspirations in this may have been the story of the crafty Isbadadden Ben Cower, Chief of Giants, Isbadadin is, to point out some intriguing parallels, a bolt-hurling murderer and torturer who resides in a great hall within a castle which is protected by ferocious guardian hounds, much like the direwolves which Gary placed in the steading of the hill giant chief. These details are found in various tellings of the Welsh myths of Culich and Olwen. But despite this parallel, the most obvious folkloric sources Gary employed in devising G1 are the History of Jack and the Giants, or Jack the Giant Killer, with its text by J. White from 1711, from Unknown Tales earlier than that, and the later and more widely known derivative successor, which is simply entitled, evocatively, Jack the Giant Killer, as featured in English Fairy Tales, a book by Joseph Jacobs of 1890. From what we know of Gary's youthful proclivities, it seems likely that he may have first learned of these particular stories as a child, via Andrew Lang's Blue Fairy Book. Today, most people know only the dim fable of Jack and the Beanstalk, this itself being the source for Gary's conception of the Cloud Giants in Dungeons & Dragons and their amazing sense of smell. However, Jack the Giant Killer, in his earliest stories, faced and defeated many other Earth-based giants, including Cormoran, Blunderbore, Rebex, Thunderdell, Galligantus, and a two-headed Welsh giant, which is technically an Eton in AD&D terms. These stories of Jack the Fighting Man collectively tell us that English earthbound giants are dim yet cunning, brutish, violent, greedy, and hateful toward mankind. These are the hill giants. They are frequently armed with tree trunk clubs. Indeed, one of the giants who threatens Jack chants grimly, "Though here you lodge with me this night, you shall not see the morning light. My club shall dash your brains out quite." We learn a bit more of the hill giant's depravity and utter lack of humor as well in The Roaring Trumpet, when Loki tells Harold Shea that when a warlock named Berger tricked a hill giant into marrying a goat, perhaps through a polymorph or illusion spell, the enraged hill giant cut Berger open, tied one end of his entrails to a tree, and chased him around it until he died. Gary certainly borrowed much from such sources, but he added a great deal more original content to make the Steading scenario all his own. When we look beyond the centuries-old inspirational tales, we can learn a great deal more from a close reading of Gary's module. There is a wealth of information crammed into the Steading's 8 module pages, and some of the secrets are merely insinuated, to be elaborated upon in later products and through Gary's later discussions with many Dungeons & Dragons fans online. But what are these secrets exactly? How can they benefit a dungeon master or a scenario designer for fantasy role-playing games? Hereafter, we will take a detailed look at Gary's cunning trove of giant secrets. I believe that you will find a considerable amount of material here, which will encourage and inspire mythic quirks in your own further adventures, no matter which role-playing game you choose to master. The Steading of the Hill Giants is a foreboding and exciting place. A considerable amount of G1's inspirational appeal lies not only in its setting and atmosphere, but also in its evocative illustrations. The very first illustration, of course, is the cover image, which was designed to hook sales, an action-filled cover piece by David C. Sutherland III. This cover features a great battle between almost overwhelmed adventurers and a huge hill giant. An average hill giant is lean and only a little over 10 feet tall, so this mighty pot-bellied specimen might well be the chieftain Nosnra himself. This depicted giant has been surprised by the party, it seems, because he has had time to pick up his sword, but not yet his stretched hide shield. One greave has been hastily fastened onto his shin, but the other one lies unattended on the floor. 2 beleaguered fighting men, humans, engage this mighty foe, who in turn is interrupting a magic user's spell by spilling wine over his head. Meanwhile, a crafty mustachioed thief is moving quickly into position for a backstabbing attack before the battle can turn into an outright disaster. The illustrated giants in G1, crafted by both Sutherland and his friend David Trampier, are true to DeCamp and Pratt's 1940 description. The hill giants are basically oversized Neanderthals, being stooped, hairy, muscular, howling and scratching, with beetle brows and jutting lower jaws. These hill giants are led by the fearsome chieftain who goes by the name of Nosnra. At first glance, Nosnra is the spelling, by the way, this seems like nothing more than an exotic Gygaxian turn of phrase, which makes an excellent name for a boorish chief. However, sharp-eyed D&D players have long known that turning Nosnra's spelling of the name around, you get the word Arneson, as in Dave Arneson, and this reveals that Gary was actually taking a moment to aim a deliberate jibe at the co-designer of the original Dungeons & Dragons game. They were quarreling at the time, but that's a story for another day. Gary and Arneson had a very unfortunate falling out, as they say, with justifiable hard feelings on both sides. The character Nosnra is not only a nod to Dave Arneson, however. Gary's hill giant chief is also a portrayal of Utgard-Loki, as featured in The Roaring Trumpet. Utgard-Loki, however, is a cunning rogue and perhaps a dabbler in illusions, while Nosnra is basically just an overgrown barbarian. Nosnra is indeed a cunning bully. He is smarter than as many tribe folk, but he is no magician, and he is certainly and secretly overmatched and controlled by far more intelligent villains who lurk in the shadows. These would be the drow folk, the dark elves, specifically Lady Aklavdra of the House of Eelserves. We will be talking about the drow in detail in videos to come. I believe Jack the Giant Killer may have again provided further inspiration for this giant chief to Gygax and Fletcher and Pratt. Consider the following. To quote, "He beheld a giant sitting upon a block of timber with a knotted iron club by his side. His goggle eyes were like flames of fire, his countenance grim and ugly, and his cheeks like a couple of large flitches of bacon, while the bristles of his beard resembled rods of iron wire." And two, there is an illustration by Arthur Rackham portraying the giant Galligantua, and this seems to be a perfect source for Gygax's completed conception of Chieftain Nosnra. The fortress dwelling, the Steading itself, is also nicely depicted in the module's pictures, and in the maps as well. This huge settlement which Nosnra and his hill giant tribe reside in is similarly inspired in part by the Roaring Trumpet. A steading at its simplest is defined collectively as a farmhouse with its outlying buildings. Nosnra's, however, is a more substantial domain, a great timber fortress built at the northern end of a dirt road. Beyond the higher peaks of the Jotuns channel waters toward a pond, which is situated down in a hidden valley about a mile to the north. Both the Roaring Trumpet and a nod to Bulfinch's mythology provide the formative inspirations for this fortress, this steading, where Utgard-Loki's Utgard Castle is described in the Roaring Trumpet as being, quote, "cruder, made of logs with the bark on, and vastly bigger, as big as a metropolitan railroad terminal." Gary's background information in G1 informs us that any adventurers who assault this steading shall be rewarded by being allowed to keep whatever they may find, even though the giants have pillaged all of their ill-won riches from innocent folk throughout the countryside of Greyhawk. This straightforward missive, too, may have been lifted by Gary from Jack the Giant Killer, as retold in English Fairy Tales in 1918, a book by Flora Annie Steele. There we read, to quote, "It so happened that one market day, Jack, the Giant Killer, then quite a young lad, found the town upside down over some new exploit of the giants. Women were weeping, men were cursing, and the magistrates were sitting in council over what was to be done, but none of them could suggest a plan. Then Jack, blithe and gay, went up to the magistrates, and with a fine curtsy, for he was ever polite, asked them what reward would be given to him who killed the giant Cormoran. The treasures of the giant's cave, quoth they. Every whit of it, quoth Jack, who was never to be done. To the last farthing, quoth they. Then will I undertake the task, said Jack, and forthwith he set about the business. The Dungeons & Dragons characters who play in the G1 module, of course, are tasked with precisely this mission and this reward. On the evening of the adventurers' first raid, there are only a few guards, the giants, posted at the gate because Chieftain Nosnra is hosting a huge celebratory feast in honor of his powerful guests. The unsupervised guards have gotten drunk and passed out at the front door. The sentry in the watchtower is asleep as well, and this explains how the adventurers can simply come right up to the front door if they're foolish enough to choose to open that path. A little deeper inside the fortress Steading, we glean a further idea of the hill giants' crude, callous nature inside their dormitory, where the children are sequestered during this evening of revelry. These big, human-sized urchins are rollicking, and beefy smacks and laughter are easily heard. Gary quite enjoyed the possibilities implied by this inclusion of giant children. He even set up a possible scenario where clever players might choose to impersonate the young hill giants, but no one ever seems to have done this in play. In setting up this prospect, Gary may have been inspired by a specific incident in the Roaring Trumpet, wherein Heimdall stuffs his furs with straw in an attempt to look bulky and giant-like so that he can escape capture outside of the fortress. It doesn't work, but it probably gave Gary the idea. Following from the dormitory, the major set piece in Nosnra's Steading is the Great Hall, which was similarly inspired by its portrayal in Roaring Trumpet. There we read that the chief's hall is, quote, filled with giants who are drinking, eating, and shouting at the tops of their voices. A whole ox is roasting in the fire pit, with room for other tasty livestock too. In describing this colorful scene, Gary may have also borrowed a bit more from Jack the Giant Killer and altered the details. In Jack, we read, Jack came to a huge hall, paved and roofed with freestone. At the upper end of this was an immense fireplace where hung an iron cauldron, the like of which, for size, Jack had never seen before. Here it was that the giants used to dine. In the midst of the great hall, the feasting chief Nosnra is entertaining an evil cloud giant, the likely guest of honor, and also 3 stone giants, who might be emissaries from a nearby allied clan. Nosnra is probably trying to win over the stone giants from their austere and unyielding true neutral philosophy, perhaps by posing the raids as being part of a larger ongoing conflict between the irksome feudal human mortals and giant kind. A little ale and mead help matters along at this feast. The stone giants might be a nod to a scene in The Hobbit, actually, but knowing Gary's preference for non-Tolkien sources, he might also be referencing Norse mythology once again. It seems probable that these stone giants are also a nod to the Leirjotnir, or clay giants of Norse mythology, and the villainous Thorfo Hrungnir, who had a heart, head, and shield all made of stone. Beyond these interesting guests, there are many other evocative monsters who serve the giants within the Steading as well. Nosnra and his tribe folk enjoy the presence of ferocious cave bear pets, faithful ogre flunkies, servants and toadies, bugbear jailers, and maltreated orcish servant slaves. An evocative illustration by David Trampier reveals what happens to orcish thralls who make mistakes while serving. One orc who has spilled the giant matron's stew during the feast is about to get walloped in the head with a mighty cast-iron skillet and sent down to the dungeons for a special punishment. This is assuming, of course, that the poor orc isn't going to be killed outright by the matron's blow. Some of the treasures hidden within the Steading are quite intriguing as well. The most compelling, to my mind, is the magic enchanted hammer, which is carefully concealed within the giant's arsenal. This hammer is well hidden, and a magic mouth spell causes misdirection so that it might mislead any snooping adventurers or thieves who might come to recover it. This appears to be Gary's winking nod to a parallel incident in the Roaring Trumpet and also in Thrimskvitha, where the giants steal Mjolnir, the hammer of Thor. There are deeper mysteries in G1 too. Down in the dungeons beneath the Steading, the adventurers may find, likely to their curious surprise, that the stonework is very old, and only slightly updated by the giants and their servants from time to time. The implication here seems to be that the Steading was built atop a much older evil stronghold of some kind, possibly a temple of the drow. There is also a vague and ambiguous hint. The ceilings of the dungeons are 20 feet high and more, and even the tunnel arches are 17 feet high at their peaks. So some of these elder evil forces or their minions may have been giants as well. Whoever these ancient builders of the dungeons were, it seems that they worshipped the elder elemental god. In this elder god's absence, the dungeon level is now ruled in Nosnra's name by the Keeper. The Keeper is a horrifying, one-eyed hunchback hill giant. He rules over the Steading's dungeons and slave population with his axe, tortures, threats, and his lethal pet carnivorous apes. His dungeon level is also being excavated and enlarged, which hints to us that Nosnra and Iklavdra are planning for a significant increase in future power. This work is being done by the giants, but also presumably by dwarven and orcish slaves. Any who dare to disobey the bugbear keepers or the keeper himself are first confined, then beaten, and then, if they still will not submit, killed, butchered, and likely eaten. Many of the orc slaves, however, have escaped from hill giant tyranny and fled to the caverns east, and while they are trapped there, a grim rebellion is in progress. These orcish rebels are in a desperate state, however, being trapped between the hill giants' loyal bugbear sentries and a series of natural caverns occupied by monstrous carrion crawlers. Gary's text and dungeon map hint to us that the ancient builders of the dungeon, meaning the elder god's worshippers, who discovered these caverns during the temple's initial rise, deliberately connected their temple complex to the underworld. Even more curious, there are 5 sinkholes which lead down from this dungeon level into a series of caves beneath, but Gary never detailed the secrets of this deeper nether cave region. The most interesting area in the entire dungeon, however, is the weird abandoned temple itself. This area appears to date to Greyhawk's Bronze Age. The temple's stonework is described in such a way, cold, slimy, shifting, and nausea-inducing, that it strongly suggests Cthulhu and R'lyeh. And its description further implies that the tentacled elder elemental god is partly a Cthulhu-inspired entity. Indeed, staring at the non-Euclidean walls of Baroque carvings there will cause any gazing adventurer to be seen from afar, and a slimy, purple, horrific thing will make contact with any such foolish dabblers in a most unnerving and fatal way. We learn quite a bit more about this slimy enigma in the dungeon module G3 later on, where a greater yet similar temple of sacrifice is guarded by the drow, the dark elves, and also the fearful fire giants. Such fascinating and pulp-infused scenes are found throughout Module G1, and for that reason, its legacy as merely a simple dungeon crawl seems completely unfair. It is much more than that. There are surely many more secrets than I have found, that it still remain buried within Steading's 8 densely written pages, but anyone who delves more cunningly than myself shall be tasked with finding them all in the days to come. My research work continues, however, for the Hawk Moor project, and right now I am studying the rest of Gary's dungeon modules with great enthusiasm. I certainly believe it is quite a testament to Gary Gygax and to Steading of the Hill Giant Chief's longevity that the module still holds so many secrets nearly 5 decades after its initial publication. I hope you find it as interesting, adventurous, and inspiring as I do. And thank you for listening to the Hawk Moor History Blog. I will talk to you some more in videos to come. Journey well.